now present For the Record.
This Labor Day weekend, we're taking an in-depth look at our state and country's workforce.
Workers are trying to advocate for their interests.
Plus, we check in on a Madison emergency response team 2 years after its start.
We're all able to work together under this common vision.
And we'll break down the child care discussion at the state capitol.
It affects everything.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Catherine Merck, filling in for Naomi Coles. It's Labor Day weekend as we continue to see what seems like a trend of labor-related issues and conversations nationwide. We're taking a deeper look at how Wisconsin lines up. Joining me to talk about this is UW-Madison professor at the School for Workers, Michael Childers. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Getting started here, we just were talking about the jobs report that came out today. We're filming this on Friday. The jobs report that came out said that unemployment rose from 3.5 to 3.8%, and hiring unexpectedly picked up in August as employers added about 180,000 jobs, despite interest rates and inflation. So what do those numbers that we were just talking about look at in terms of how unemployment stands?
I'd say that the employment outlook is basically steady. You see a little bit of a blip up as a result of, well, there was a major employer loss in transportation, and the yellow trucking, despite the COVID money that they got, we're still not able to continue operations. But in general, I think the Fed is looking very carefully at this in terms of if they're going to need to raise rates again, or if the economy is kind of on track for a soft landing.
How does Wisconsin shape up in terms of unemployment compared to other states, and what could be credited to?
Well, I mean, nationwide, it's pretty close to historical lows, and it's the same here in Wisconsin as well. I mean, basically, employers continue to be seeking workers to fill positions that they have.
The jobs report also showed that wage gains are easing. Average hourly pay rose from 0.2% from July to August, the smallest gain in a year and a half. And measured over a year, the wages last month were up 4.3 from August of 2022% there. So what does that mean in terms of wages adjusting to inflation? That seems like a concern that a lot of people have in a lot of jobs, that my job is not adjusting to inflation. What are we seeing with the numbers?
I mean, again, you said it, there's still a gap between what workers have been able to get back in terms of their wages and where inflation's heading, which frankly is what the Fed wants to see in terms of making sure that wages are not inflaming additional inflation rates. So again, workers are still trying to get caught up, but that has eased significantly. So while it's anybody's guess what the Fed will do, that's probably an indicator that they shouldn't have to raise rates yet again at this point. So we'll
even though workers are, making these cries for higher wages, you don't think that maybe that's the right move to adjust to this?
Well, again, you have to really unpack the jobs report, but I mean, the quit rate is down as well, which means, again, the employment picture is becoming more stable for employers. And yeah, workers are hopefully trying to adapt to this new reality. And in a lot of labor actions, the primary goal is we need more money, right? We need to raise our wages to try to keep up.
I want to talk about now some of these strikes that we're seeing across the country and here in Wisconsin. In our state, we're seeing many labor unions. Examples locally include TruStage, Leinenkugels, and other local businesses in Madison that are going through these strikes. But then nationwide, we're seeing trends like the service and the creative industries on the picket line more and more. Why do you think this is happening? Why are we seeing this?
Well, in general, every one of these groups of workers has their own specific reasons, but I'd say the overarching thing is, again, you said it, workers are trying to advocate for their interests, and in those specific instances you talked about in Wisconsin, wage rates, et cetera, I think everybody was watching really carefully on the Teamsters and the UPS negotiation, because again, that's such a large group of workers that would have had such a huge impact on our economy, and they were able to, at the 11th hour, negotiate an acceptable agreement, which kind of avoided that disruption to the supply chains, et cetera. But yeah, workers are still trying, and then in the case of the kind of pending situation with United Auto Workers and the big three automakers, workers are saying, you guys are enjoying record profits. We should be sharing in that. We gave back a lot during COVID, and we would like to get that back.
I'm definitely going to address COVID in just a second here. But in terms of going back to these strikes that we're seeing, what does that mean in terms of union participation? I think a lot of people are seeing these on TV, these strikes, and thinking, wow, it feels like a lot of people are joining unions and getting their voice heard. Is that something that we're seeing, union participation up?
I think if we look at the NLRB numbers, the request for representation elections, in other words, groups of workers that are trying to form unions, has definitely gone up in terms of the number of petitions filed. I think there's been a lot more media coverage, frankly, since COVID in terms of the workers having the kind of their interests or needs being, put out in the popular media. But I guess I would say that's always been the case. I mean, in terms of workers will come together whenever they feel like, they're not getting a fair shake at their job.
Later in the show, our political reporter Will Keneally is going to address another state of child care bills making their way around the Capitol. That's an obvious big topic of discussion at the statewide level. Has a need for child care influenced the workforce and the trends that we're seeing right now?
Oh, there's no question. And that's been a long-term issue here in the United States with the kind of lack of any kind of systematic program. Yeah, it affects everything from participation rates in the workforce where, again, if you have to be the caregiver, and the cost is a real issue because, again, you have to do the calculus where depending on the compensation I can receive at work, if I'm going to have to just hand it over to a child care provider that I can trust with my children, maybe I should be at home just taking care of my kids.
Something that you touched on a little bit ago, the COVID pandemic completely disrupted labor markets. You're laughing in the way that, yes, it disrupted everything.
Absolutely.
Unemployment has been trending downward since 2020, but what can we expect in the coming years as the state continues to recover from the events of COVID?
I mean, in a lot of sense, that's still getting unpacked. I would say that the one thing that's interesting that a lot of labor economists are still looking at carefully is the whole labor participation number, which is still, I mean, the jobs have essentially recovered, and employment, again, like we talked about, is historically low, which generally tends to favor workers, right? Because, again, they have options. And that we saw that kind of at the beginning part of coming out of the pandemic. That's starting to level off. But again, I mean, I think that there is really there's no way to understand how labor participation is going to continue to grow without addressing some of these concerns like childcare.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks.
We'll be right back.